And all week on The Most, we've been bringing you some of the 2008 contenders who aren't necessarily grabbing all the headlines all the time. The ones flying a little bit under the radar, like a man who served as a Texas congressman 3 times, re-elected in '06 by a 20-point margin. He's a physician, he's pro-life, and he has never voted to raise taxes. Republican Congressman Ron Paul is our guest. Welcome, Congressman. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
You are one of the very few lawmakers, Republicans or otherwise, who voted against the Iraq War. Will that be a centerpiece of your campaign?
Well, it certainly should be, because that represents a foreign policy that I believe so strongly in, and that we should not fight wars that are undeclared, and that we should mind our own business and take the advice of the founders, and that is stay out of entangling alliances, don't get involved in nation building, and don't get involved in the internal affairs of other nations. A lot more Americans would be alive if we followed that policy, and the world would be at greater peace.
Well, we are involved, and we need to take care of the troops that are over there with the funding bill. But you wrote on your website last week about the House bill. The House passed an emergency supplemental spending bill that was the worst of all worlds. That's what I read on your website. What would have to change to make that bill worthwhile?
Well, probably just forget about it, because we don't need any more money to bring the troops home. I mean, we already have $600 or $700 billion in the pipeline, so there's a more than adequate funds available to take care of our troops and make sure they're out of harm's way and bring them home. So we don't need that funding. What we need is more funding for our veterans. We neglect our veterans, we neglect our hospitals. At the same time, we're over there spending even more money to perpetuate a war, and the Democrats have not offered an alternative. So I think the Republican alternative ought to be that we ought to mind our own business. President Bush ran on this program of not policing the world and not getting involved in the internal affairs of other nations. Stay out of nation building. I think it's a great policy.
So you just want all the troops to come home. That's what you would do right now if you were president.
Well, you can't do it in 24 hours, but you should design a policy of non-intervention. And why do we have troops in Korea for more than 50 years? And why do we occupy Europe? I mean, we're going broke, and we don't need this. We need this money to be spent at home. We need to worry about our borders here at home, not worry about the borders around the world and the borders between Syria and Iraq. I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with our national security. We ought to deal with our own national security. Our military right now is in shambles. It's a mess because we've been stretched too thin. So one of these days we're going to have to wake up, and I'm afraid we won't wake up until we go bankrupt, and we're approaching that time already.
One issue that you care deeply about is limiting the power of the executive branch of your presidency. The investigation into the firing of those 8 U.S. attorneys could test the limits of executive privilege. Should it come to that?
Well, I don't think that should be that controversial. I think legally the president has the right to fire these attorneys, so I don't think that should be that controversial. I think the story behind that is the motivation behind it, and that's why it's being politicized. But I don't think that's a constitutional crisis.
Dr. Paul, you're running as a Republican, but correct me if I'm wrong, you're a member of the Libertarian Party as well?
I am also.
You've said in interviews that Republicans are turned off right now, Republican voters. How would you turn them back on, sir?
Well, I would introduce this novel idea that we ought to follow the Constitution. There are still a few Americans that believe in it, and that means the government should be very limited, and the power of the presidency should be limited. Presidents shouldn't fight wars that are undeclared. Put the pressure on the Congress to it. Meet their own responsibilities. I don't think we should be expanding the welfare state, and yet the Republican Party in the last 6 years has doubled the size of the Department of Education. They have expanded medical care benefits, expanding the prescription drug program. So I don't think that's part of the Republican position. We used to be for balanced budgets and limited government and cutting down on the size and scope of government. And I think that message resounds very well. There's a lot of Republicans still left out there that believe that government ought to be limited and have respect for the Constitution. I know that's a novel idea, but still I think it's worth presenting.
Here's a novel idea a lot of people think for Washington. People getting along. We saw the President and the House Speaker exchanging words yesterday. Are you someone who can reach across the aisle?
Absolutely. I think the issue is the most important thing. I don't like the partisanship around here. So on the war issue, obviously I work with a lot of Democrats on the war issue. On the entitlement programs and market issues, I work with a lot of conservatives. And I think a president should be working on both sides of the aisle and work on the merits. And I don't know why we can't rally around with around this very simple approach of saying, you know, we all take the same oath of office to obey the Constitution. We got ourselves into trouble because we disobeyed the Constitution. We could get back on track by merely living up to our oath of office.
Congressman Dr. Ron Paul, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Our Under the